So our next speaker is going to be Geoffrey Bradway, who's going to be talking about how to create a tone in plotter art. So one of the challenges of producing a piece of a work in with a pen is that the pen can only be on the page or not on the page drawing. So you kind of have this binary 1 or 0, and it can be how do you take that and produce something that has somewhere in between, not black, not white, but some sort of gray. And so Jeff is here to tell us about that. Take it away, Jeff. Do you want this microphone, or do you want?
I can use that one. Yeah, so he basically just stole my title introduction notes. So let's just jump into it. So yeah, today we're basically going to be talking about 3 things. So a bit about my personal background, how I got into this, what my sort of end goals that I still haven't achieved are, a lot of the techniques that I've discovered along the way. So more like here's what they're formally called, so you can Google them, because I am by no means an expert. I'm probably going to butcher some stuff. But, hopefully you'll walk away with this talk, like having an idea of, okay, what you can look up to get more into it. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about a couple of sort of homespun algorithms that I made to, actually solve these problems and actually, like tackle them and plot them. All right, so I got my AxiDraw about 3 months ago, and one of the things that I've always kind of wanted to do is I've always wanted to do a photorealistic render. So, from this picture you can kind of see like, okay, this was made with a single ballpoint pen, and it looks like the person, right? Like you can tell, okay, they were looking at a photograph, they made it super authentic, and if they can do that with one pen, then it's like, okay, doing this with an AxiDraw seems like it should be a achievable goal somehow. So, day one I get it. I am super excited. I have no idea what the hell I'm doing. So I plug it into Inkscape. I'm reading the user manual. That's what it says to do. And I basically try and take it through the basic algorithm. At this point in time, I haven't learned what an SVG is. It's yelling at me because like, oh, I need a bitmap or whatever. I don't know what it's talking about. And so, I run it through this algorithm, and basically what it's doing is it converts my image to black and white, it picks a couple of different color thresholds, and then it outlines it, and then it draws the contours. And, this is sort of what you get, and, okay, I'm looking at this, and I'm like, okay, you can tell it's something, right? You can tell, like, okay, that's roughly me, there's a dude in the background, you can see the light, it's something. But, clearly it's, a far cry away from what I'm doing. And yeah, so I sort of realized initially, like, okay, I don't really know what I'm doing. So like I started to get progressively better. And so I want to basically take a second to shamelessly shill for this website, because I've personally just found this to be the best thing to help get me up to speed in, plotting cool things and, figuring out how this stuff works and like how to do a lot of specific effects. It's called turtletoy.net, and yeah, essentially how it's structured is you have a lot of these turtles where, I've sort of displayed one where, okay, it will show you what is rendered on the canvas, and it will walk you, or not walk you through, but it'll have all the code. So you can like pull one up, you can start modifying the parameters, you can make your own. They have a backlog of like, like dozens of these, and so you can really see like, okay, how do I do, like these renderings in JavaScript? How do I do more continuous stuff? How do I get all of these certain effects that like a lot of these people are doing? And so yeah, honestly, if you come away with one takeaway from my talk, it's go check out turtletoy.net. You'll be excited. So yeah, I kind of had an aha moment where, okay, so like all I'm doing in this plot is I'm plotting lines, right? But you can kind of see 3 effects emerge when you look at this. So you can see, obviously there's areas that are still just lines, but you can also see another area where it's dark blue and sort of areas where, it's this like lighter intermediate shade of blue. And the interesting thing is, like, these lines are close enough together that it no longer looks like lines, right? When you're at a distance, it looks almost like it's smudged together, and you're getting this continuous tone. And, you know, if you sort of dive back to the picture earlier, it's, you know, it's a lot of continuous tones from these lines. And so this kind of seemed like a really good start, where it's like, okay, well, we can control colors by just controlling how dense the lines are together. So if we go in and we plot them close together, then, okay, it will just appear way darker than if they're more spread apart. And if they're too far apart, then we will be able to still tell the individual lines. And so yeah, after kind of much toiling on my own personal algorithms, you know, I came up with a plot that looked like this. Yeah, it's not completely perfect. You can kind of tell where the plotters, where the ink dried up. And so plotter pro tip, when you're doing these things, okay, if it's going to be, you know, this multi-hour render, you probably want to like do it in multiple layers and swap out your pens, you know, and, you know, like make sure they're flowing in between it, or else you'll get weird artifacts, which I discovered the hard way. But yeah, so I'm going to dive into exactly how I made this later on in the talk. But, you know, like, okay, you can see by controlling line densities, like, you get a fairly good image. So I was, you know, like, I'd worked pretty hard on this. I thought I was pretty ingenious doing this. And I was showing it off to all my friends. And I was talking with one of my friends, Simon. And, you know, we were talking, and it says, like, oh, so, like, you just reinvented halftones. And, you know, I'm just sitting there being like, wait, what? What's a halftone? And so this brings us to the technique portion, which is a lot of the stuff I Googled after learning what a halftone was. So yeah, specifically a halftone is basically a way you can sort of fake this continuous color gradient. Specifically, they're using dots, but, you know, you can kind of imagine, like, you know, we're all clever people. We can imagine, okay, instead of dots, it's lines or stars or like whatever, you know, pattern. And so basically by replicating this pattern over and over, you can, you know, get gradients. And there's effectively two things you can control to sort of control like how light and how dark it is. And that is the size of your pattern. So like you can tell with these dots, okay, these dots are basically just getting bigger. You know, they're actually like on the same grid lines, but you're changing how, like, the radius of them based off of how dark it is. And then the other one is the spacing, right? So the spacing is sort of what we saw in the line example where, okay, if things are really, really close together, you know, they're going to appear darker. If they're farther apart, they're going to appear lighter. And so all of these work by an optical illusion. You know, but I'm a firm believer, to be is to be perceived. So yeah, so the first of the many sort of techniques to do this is, you know, one of the more famous ones that's called stippling. So it kind of also has a counter technique in printmaking called mezzotints. And so stippling is just when you use little dots, right? And what you're doing is, you're typically not varying the size of the dots, although you can, but what you're doing is you're varying the density. So you can sort of tell, okay, where it's darker, you need a lot of little dots. And so the difference between stippling and mezzotints are, okay, stippling is additive because you're drawing ink on the paper, and mezzotints are actually subtractive because it's a printmaking technique. And so what you're doing is, like, you could imagine getting like a giant piece of wood, and what you're actually doing is you're taking like a needle and you're basically poking holes in it, and then what happens is, so you're subtracting it from the wood, and then as you like put ink into it, like that ink will flow into the holes. And then, you know, you put your piece of paper on it, you like stamp it or whatever, you know, and you get the same effect. And so here's what it looks like when you plot it. You guys can use this code stipplegen made by the nice folks who also make the AxiDraw. And yeah, it's, yeah, you can find it online, and it's super cool. It lets you control sort of like how many dots you have, the size range, and, you know, a bunch of different parameters, and, you know, it gets pretty good effects. I think this was something using something like a couple thousand dots. And then, so this kind of leads us into the next technique where it's called dithering. So if you look at kind of the pre-rendering of the picture I had earlier, you can see these like funky color bands. And basically what's going on is when you do thresholding, you're basically, you're doing something like the 8-bit gradient where like, okay, you're taking this continuous space and you're discretizing it into, in this case, 8 different channels. And what you see is, okay, there's a very hard cutoff in between these. And so dithering, the idea behind dithering is basically like, okay, well, this thresholding technique sort of introduces an element of coarseness that like is very obvious and very apparent, but you can sort of get around this by using random noise to actually blur these together, right? So if you look at the dithered 8-bit, like that's almost visually identical to the the 24-bit, right? So you're increasing sort of your visual resolution by a factor of 3. I mean, I have no idea if that's actually what you're doing, but it sounds cool. Yeah, but you can see like it's a much more faithful representation. And yeah, there's a bunch of different types of doing it, basically. So yeah, so thresholding is a type of dithering, doing sort of random noises. But then there's a couple more advanced algorithms called Floyd and Steinberg, which are basically trying to do like this error diffusion. And this is fairly complicated, so I don't want to like dive that much into it in this talk. But now you know about dithering, and you can Google it. Okay, the next one is sort of hatching, and hatching is a very common one when you're drawing, and it's basically just filling it in with different parallel lines, right? So you have single hatching, which is you use one set of parallel lines, cross hatching, where you use lines at angles, and contour hatching, where okay, you take the shape and you fill it in around the shapes of the contours. And yeah, here are some cool plots that actually use this. So these aren't mine. These are a guy, Ben Gohler's. I actually found his stuff on Twitter when I was trying to find a plot of the Michelangelo's David's dithering, but I found these instead, so it was a win. Yeah, and you can tell, okay, so he uses this cross-hatching where, okay, the lighter ones are all single ones, and the darker ones are, these cross-hatched lines. Okay, so up until this point, we've been using essentially like an implicit color scale, right? We've been using a color scale where, okay, you have black at one end and white at the other, and you have shades of gray in between. And that's kind of cool, but you can sort of imagine doing it a different way where, okay, instead of using a gradient between white and black, you can swap it out for any 2 colors, right? So the spring is, you're swapping it out between pink and yellow. Summer is green and yellow. These are all matplotlib color maps, if you were wondering. But this sort of gives you an idea of doing these gradients between 2 colors, right? And you can just sort of imagine swapping one out for another. And if you want to find example of this in the real world, you have to look no further than Spotify, because they absolutely love doing this to every single one of their album covers. And now that you know about it, you'll never be able to unsee it. And yeah, here's sort of what it looks like if you were to do it in plotting, right? Where, basically what I did was I substituted out, okay, all of the blacks for purple, and then like the lighter grays for red. And you can sort of see these like two-tone fades. All right, and so yeah, now that we're kind of thinking about doing more advanced things with color, this is kind of this is getting out of the range of monotone colors, and this is more okay, like how do you actually deal with color space in general? So okay, the idea is if you have a certain set of basis colors, how do you actually represent the colors that they do? And so I'm sure we're all familiar with kind of like the RGB color model where, okay, you can add any of the colors from RGB together to get any of the other colors. That's what your monitor does. There's another one that's very popular called CMYK. So it's a subtractive one because in RGB I always forget like which what makes it subtractive and what makes it additive, because I believe it's, okay, the absence of all your colors are white, and then if you add them all together, you get black, whereas RGB is the opposite. And this is sort of what you see when you see a comic book, printed, from like the 1950s, or like a Roy Lichtenstein painting. And yeah, so here's sort of a cool example of like what this optical illusion is doing under the hood. And so you can see on the far left that, okay, you get these really nice colors. You're seeing, this full range of stuff where, okay, it looks just like a painting painted with all these colors. And, as you zoom in more and more, you actually see like, okay, these are using a lot of the techniques we've learned. They're altering the dot sizes. They're altering the, sort of the colors. And then they're using these additive models to effectively simulate all of the colors that you would see in the original painting. All right, so let's actually talk for a minute about how you make these. So, okay, going back to the sort of original one of the girl, the idea was like, okay, I had just seen the picture off Turtle Toy, and it's like, okay, different line densities create different colors. So how can we turn this into a thing that my robot can draw? And the basic idea was, okay, well, these things are big matrices, right? They're big color value matrices. So what if we define line density to sort of be this linear decomposition of our things where, okay, we'll break our row space into 4 distinct ones that are repeating. So we have red, orange, yellow, blue. I mean, those are arbitrary colors I picked. And you can sort of imagine, okay, if you want something to be the darkest color, it's going to have to be on all 4 lines, right? So you're going to want it to be drawn on the red line, orange line, yellow line, blue line. If you want something to be white, then you don't want to draw it on any of the lines. And then you can, interpolate from there, right? So if it should be the 3rd darkest tone, then, okay, you draw it on channels 1, 2, 3. If you want it to be the second one, 1, 2, and the lightest color, you just draw it on, 1 channel. And, okay, so like now that we have this idea, what we can do is we can start thinking of our input image as kind of like these like binary blobs, right? Where, okay, we have a black and white image, and you pick a threshold to sort of threshold at it. And basically, like, what you'll sort of notice is if you, so, these colors go from 0 to 255, and 255 is white. So if you keep increasing your threshold, your blobs are just going to get bigger and bigger. And so you can kind of imagine, like, okay, the second blob is going to have everything that the first blob in it is going to have, and the third one's going to have the first 2, and the fourth one's going to have all 3 of them. And so you could essentially, like, the trick here is what you can do is you can assign each blob to a different color channel, or a different line channel, right? So the first blob can be painted on the red, the second one can be painted on the orange, the third one can be painted on the blue, and the fourth one can be painted on the red. But now, because of how it works, the dark ones, because it's present in all 4 of the images, it's going to map to being on all 4 of the output channels. And the second one, because it's in 3 of them, is going to map to being on 3 of it. Same with 2 and same with 1. And so like now we're getting this color gradient that we want to see. Yeah, and this is just using more words to describe what I just said. And yeah, here's the results as we sort of saw before, complete with color banding. And yeah, the other one we were sort of talking about is hatching. So how do you make a cool contour hatching algorithm? And I actually did this one also before I sort of got into more of the formal techniques. And the motivation was like, okay, well, if we go back to this one looks great. I'm happy with it. But like if you zoom in on it, oh, I can do it. Cool. Like you can very much tell it's like lines, right? Like you can tell, okay, this was a mechanical process that made this thing, and that's not exactly what I want, right? Like I want these things to look like they're photographs. And so, the premonition was like, okay, well maybe if I hatch based off of the contours, it will look more like the actual photograph does. And so for us to do this contour algorithm, we're going to need some tricks from image morphology. And so this is basically studying like the blobs you see in images as sort of like shapes from more of a mathematical perspective. But we're going to need essentially two functions from this. So we're going to need to use image erosion and image dilation. So dilation is like, okay, you have a blob, and you basically add a bit of a boundary to the edge of it. And image erosion is you're eroding it, right? So you're taking away like a certain threshold. And so yeah, you can sort of imagine what you do with contouring is, okay, you take your threshold of blob, and this time you don't have the additive ones. You have them be like mutually exclusive. And yeah, basically what you do is, okay, you draw a line around the contour, cool, and then you erode it a little bit. And now you have a slightly, like smaller blob, and you draw a line around that contour. You erode it again, draw a line around that contour, and you just keep doing this. And this is essentially trying to give you almost like a topological map. And what you can do is, by controlling the amount you eroded at every point, you're controlling how light or dark it's going to like appear. There should have been stuff on that slide, but there isn't. So yeah, this is how this actually turns out. So okay, on the left is the rendering, and that's to sort of give you a feel for how weird it turned out. I was not expecting any of this, and so the one on the right actually does sort of look like, it almost looks like a Chuck Close, right? Where it's like, okay, you can tell it's a photograph, you can tell it's this dude, but it just looks bizarre. And basically the reason that this actually happened is, okay, when you do the lightness thresholds on the original image, you get a lot of speckling. So what happens is you'll see a lot of these things where, okay, like you can tell, this was sort of one color mapped, but like there are areas that were different. Like there were these speckles that were like slightly different colors, and so that's what's sort of alluding to this weird, this weird texture. All right, so those are sort of the two big algorithms like I've done personally. I just wanted to, like kind of showcase what I'm thinking of next on my roadmap. So, because we're still not there to photorealistic things yet. So the next kind of big idea I had that I want to work on is using Laplacian pyramids. So what a Laplacian pyramid is you take an image and you downsample it. So that's just, what you're doing is you're basically subsampling it in almost kind of like a random way to avoid aliasing, where you're getting a reduced image of your thing, and you can subsample it again and again and again. And so that's what you're doing over on the right. And then what you can do is you can actually upsample those. So you can sort of blow them up and keep blowing them up. And what you can do is take the differences. So you're going to end up with like a base image, which is sort of your most blown up thing, and then you're going to end up with like a difference, like hierarchy, right? Where it's sort of the difference between, the fourth layer, sampled down and the fourth layer sampled up. And the reason you want to do this is because you basically end up with two outputs. You end up with this picture in the middle, which is like this blurry light-darkness map, and you end up with these differences on the right. And the reason you want to do this is because what you've just done is you've almost decoupled how you do the tones and how you do the outlines. So you have outlines at different resolutions, so it's hard to tell, but like these guys are like almost like thicker lines than these guys than these guys, because they're like different levels of resolution. And now what you can do is you can, you could basically imagine, okay, like now that you have this Laplacian pyramid and you can separate it into like tonal space and outline space, now you can make something that will specialize in drawing outlines, and you can make something that specializes in drawing shading. And yeah, the other sort of big idea I had for a project was, okay, you could also make a bend dot renderer. So this is, kind of like what Roy Lichtenstein does or the comic books. And effectively, like here's the trick, is like, all you would need to do is you need to just import your image as like a CMYK. And then what you could do is you could use dithering on each of those color channels to make dots. And then you probably want to like randomize it a little bit, so there's like a little bit of spacing. But then if you just like draw those as 3 different layers, then you should get these additive effects where you can map to any color. Cool. So yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about. yeah, if any of you guys want sort of some of the source code of things I'm working on, or to exchange ideas, or just to like keep in touch, here's all my contact, and yeah, thank you for coming.